I'm Neal Berntsen, and I'm sitting here at Carnegie Mellon University with my good friend and colleague, Tom Rolfs. We are here talking about Vincent Cichowicz, and we were both lucky enough to be students of his. We both attended Northwestern as classmates, and I think, both feel like we owe a great deal of the success we've had in our careers to the lessons we learned from Vince Cichowicz.
I agree. I think it's safe to say that neither of us would have the jobs we have today without his help and influence. And I know he changed my life. I think we've both talked about this. He's changed your life as well. And we spent a little time today recording his flow studies.
You know, the Cichowicz family, Mike Cichowicz, his son, is in the process of putting together the flow study book, which contains the collection of flow studies that he collected over the course of his career, and they're going to be released soon in a book form where students will be able to continue to learn from the lessons that he was trying to give us all. And the purpose of this video today is we thought it would be smart to talk a little bit about those flow studies and how Mr. Cichowicz approached them. It might be a useful tool.
I think a lot of people it would be helpful for a lot of people to understand how he wanted them played and how he assigned them to us, and it's not really a technical exercise. It's more of a breathing exercise, a music exercise. These flow studies are meant not to develop a spectacular technique, but to develop a sound airflow, a sound system of moving the air through the instrument in a musical and beautiful way.
Yeah, every week you would go in for your lesson with Mr. Cichowicz, and he would give you, I called it my prescription for good health and trumpet playing.
Which I still have in my studio.
Right, and always started off with his slurs, the Cichowicz slurs, ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, which Mike Cichowicz and Mark Doolin, they published a volume of those slurs last year. Ideally you'd play through a series of those slurs at the very beginning of the day, after maybe a little bit of mouthpiece buzzing.
Maybe a little bit of mouthpiece buzzing, but the long tones, as he called them, were key to the day and setting up the day. And you would start off the day with those long tones, and with as little tension and as much freedom and ease as possible, and then build upon that. And shortly after the long tones, we'd move on to either a rashu or maybe to the flow studies. And then after the flow studies, maybe on to a bousquet or some kind of articulation. Always applying the same kind of airflow and easy airflow that we did with the long tones. So the flow studies were key to the whole development of the day, and we thought it would be important for us to play these flow studies so we could hopefully demonstrate the way that Mr. Cichowicz liked to have us play them.
Mr. Cichowicz was a brilliant educator, and I think he would have been a great teacher no matter what the subject was. We were fortunate that he was a trumpet player and a trumpet teacher. I think that, it's difficult to say that this is how Mr. Cichowicz taught, because he looked at each student very individually and had the unique ability to diagnose problems on a very individual basis and then fix them depending on what you needed.
Yeah, we all have a different take on a different interpretation of what he taught us. And while he was a very gentle guy, a very kind man, and it seemed to be lacking of all ego, he was tenacious in his desire for us to play well.
Exacting. He was exacting.
That's right.
But I don't want to give the impression when we speak here that we're telling you this is exactly how it was. We're going to give you the idea of how it was for us. But I do believe that he had a general idea that your playing began and there was a progression involved, which moved you in from starting to get the air moving with his slurs into some little, longer bursts of air, which might be a flow study or a rochou, and then into some sort of an etude, which wouldn't be particularly difficult. You would go maybe into, as Tom said, you'd go into bousquet. You wouldn't go into a top tones at that point.
But the goal is to have the whole day to be able to play with that same kind of ease, and that includes playing some strenuous orchestral piece of orchestral literature. Maybe we should talk a bit about the flow studies and exactly, what would you say that you took away from his teaching of those flow studies? How do you approach the flow studies?
Well, I always talk about the flow studies. I believe that the flow studies are all about how you're playing, not what you're playing. That the goal is to play in an effortless way, to have the air flowing freely and very efficiently. Therefore, we're not trying to play anything particularly fast. You don't want to clutter your mind with having to think about, technical issues. You want to be able to just let things flow naturally out of you. I think also that the flow studies, in terms of the rhythm, does not have to be exact. That as you come to the natural end of a phrase, Mr. Cichowicz would very much want you to retard at the end of a phrase, take a natural breath, and continue on in a very musical way.
And he would be insistent on, if you need a breath, take your time, take a breath. And it didn't need to be the same breath every single time. It could vary from day to day. However you felt the musical phrase was going, how you felt as a player, and you just take a breath, take your time, but always, above all, always play beautifully. Always, everything is very beautiful, very musical, as much beauty as you can muster on these technical exercises, which are technical exercises.
They do become technical.
And by the way, which brings us, we should talk about the traditional long tone. He didn't really, at least with me, didn't really believe in that. He discouraged me from playing. For what he calls the long tone studies are not what most people call long tone, which is holding one note for a long period of time.
I think that when he got into his idea of his long tone, the Cichowicz slurs, if you will, it was in reaction to the Schlossberg. Ba da 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 da.
Please stop that, Neal.
Okay, that was not my good singing voice. I apologize. He could have. I think that Mr. Cichowicz, thought that led to static air. That led to the air being inactive and just kind of sitting there, and that led to poor playing. And the idea of having the more linear scale passage in his slurs was an attempt to get you to have your air be more active.
Right.
He developed his slurs. I think that, there were many discussions going on by the players in the Chicago Symphony at this time, right? With Mr. Cichowicz and with Arnold Jacobs. And they were, up to this point, I think a lot of what was brass teaching and playing was, that you need to exercise your chops, and that, it's all about getting your chops strong. And they didn't, at that time, I think, talk about having, the air be what drove everything, that everything kind of rides on the air. And I think this was, the Cichowicz developed those slurs in response to the discussions he had with Jacobs.
But he wanted that same kind of airflow applied to all other parts of playing. So
Absolutely.
it comes down to the difference between soft playing and loud playing is a slow airstream and a fast airstream. It's really not that hard to play loud.
Yeah.
But we always convince ourselves, put the mouthpiece up to the face, we convince ourselves it is hard. And it's actually just faster air.
Yeah.
And he was tenacious in driving that point home. At least he was with me. Maybe you were quicker than I was, but the same thing with our articulation. The tongue rides along the airstream.
Well, I think that for me, my articulation was always an issue, and so we worked so much on articulation. And he talked about how you need to have the air the air is constant, and then the tongue just bounces on that constant stream
Right.
of air. And that if the notes are supposed to sound short, if they're staccato, it's almost that you create an illusion by having a very crisp attack, a very defined attack, but the airflow is still always solid. He did a lot of things with air patterns. If you were playing, say, Petrushka, you might spend a good portion of your lesson going, and then have you go do that into the horn, da 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 da, not to have it be.
Well, he would have me start with the air patterns and then move to the mouthpiece and then to the trumpet.
Yeah.
And it was and it's basically how he did it. It's consistent with how he sets up the whole day. You start easy and you gradually get harder, and trying not to let any tension sneak into the body. For me, it wasn't articulation; it was tension. I was a very tight player, and he helped me with that, and just with an ease of an airstream. And every day I have to renew that every single morning of getting the tension out of my playing.
You should try to just remember from the day before.
But thank you, Neal. That's sage advice.
Yeah, yeah.
Neal and I were just talking about Mr. Cichowicz's teaching technique, and at the time when I was studying with him, the frustrating part is he kept everything so simple, and conceptually it was simple. I understood it. I understood what I had to do, but it was incredibly frustrating attaining that goal. So when we talk about his teaching technique, it was a very simple approach to playing the trumpet, and he liked to condense everything down to the easiest, simplest, clearest approach to playing. So when I talk about it, it doesn't seem that complicated, but I remember how incredibly frustrating it was to know what I had to do because he explained it so well and not be able to attain that goal.
Yeah, I think that, kind of ingrained in the DNA of a young trumpet player is that if something is difficult, that then, therefore, we must engage more muscles.
Yeah.
And that he wanted it almost to be exactly the opposite.
Right.
The more difficult something became, the more you kind of had to let go and just trust and let it just be there.
Yeah.
And let the work that you've done carry you through.
I don't know if I ever told you this, I also remember the day when he put his hand on my shoulder and says, "Tom, I think you finally got it."
Wow.
And it was quite a day.
Yeah. I guess I never had that.
Well, there's something else I wanted to add about Mr. Cichowicz that I think is really important to know, and that is, with him, it wasn't about his ego, it wasn't about his reputation. He didn't care about any of that stuff. He was a true teacher in the sense that all he cared about was helping players, helping people. I think he generally got a kick out of helping players play better. He didn't care what anybody else thought of them. It was just all about helping the player that's sitting next to him.
Well, I remember when we were in school, just a few years ago, that, when you look back on it, I was there. I'm in the Pittsburgh Symphony. Your principal trumpet of the Boston Symphony, Mark Hughes, principal trumpet in Houston, was there.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Walp, who was in Houston Symphony, was there.
Bob
Dorer, who is in the Minnesota Orchestra.
Yukihiro Sakiyama,
principal trumpet in the NHK in Japan. And and then many other people. Bruce Briney, who's Bruce Briney, Kevin Hartman, Judy Saxon are all great teachers. And all of those people were there, and there were some really fine trumpet players there. And I remember at the end of our time there, there was one kid that wasn't really up to the level of everybody else, but he really improved dramatically. And Cichowicz said, he thought that was the kid that gave him the most pride.
That was his biggest success.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it wasn't us.
Yeah, so that's the kind of guy he was.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.